This program is brought to you by Emory University.
I'm going to start with when I was a child. And my life at that time was a lot more like the life of Jesus Christ than it is now. Literally, not only I, but all my neighbors and friends. Almost all of my neighbors were African American families. And our family was a little bit better off, and my daddy owned land. But we lived in a time when very few people had automobiles. Nobody had a radio. My family had a radio, but it was we don't have electricity, so we had to run it from a battery, and my daddy was very stingy with depleting the battery, so we only listened to special programs. No television. We had a telephone, which of course Jesus didn't have, but there were 3 people on our line, and so whenever our telephone rang, which was a long and a short, we knew that 4 people were on the telephone listening to what we said. The 3 people whose phone rang along with ours, and also the operator in planes. And so almost all the transportation then was by walking, or riding horses or mules, or riding on wagons. So we didn't have running water in our house either until much later in my life. And that was 85 years ago. It was during the Great Depression. And another thing that was similar was that the average wage for a grown, able-bodied man who had good intelligence, enough to take care of animals in an adult, mature way, their pay for 16 hours of work was $1. And for an able-bodied woman, the pay was 75 cents a day. And for a teenager, like some of you boys, it would be 50 cents a day. But also at that time, a loaf of bread was 5 cents. Eggs were 1 cent each. And you could buy a pair of shoes for $1.50. You could buy a pair of overalls for $1.50. So things were different. And then at that time, my only ambition in life was to go to Annapolis. Nobody in my daddy's family had ever finished high school before me. My daddy had a good education, which was 10 years, 10th grade. He went through the 10th grade at Riverside Academy, which was a military academy over near Augusta, Georgia. But my daddy wanted me to have a chance to go to college. And the only 2 free colleges in the nation back in the Depression years was Annapolis and West Point. And I had a favorite uncle who was a Navy enlisted man in the Pacific Ocean, and so I decided to go to Annapolis. So when I was 6 years old, if you asked me what I wanted to do when I grew up, I would say like a parrot, I want to go to Annapolis and be a naval officer. I didn't know quite what it meant. And then about 70 years later, I wrote this book, which I still think is the best book available. I don't think it's on your reading list.
No, they did read it.
They did read it?
Oh, portions.
Okay, well, so I think this book pretty well describes what I think about the virtues, which I got a lot of criticism by using the word virtues, of aging. What are the virtues of aging? Why is aging filled with not only a more gratifying possibility in life, but also a better opportunity to do good things for other people? Those are the 2 basic definitions of virtue in the Bible, or in the dictionary. To have a gratifying experience of your own, and also to be able to do something for other people. And I think still, after writing this book, that that comes with retirement age. What is retirement age? Well, there was a poll done, which I describe in the book, that said, what do you think should be the average age of retirement? And that was on a nationwide basis. And most people in America thought that the best age of retirement would be about 52 or 53. And then the other question they asked on the same poll was, when do you think a person is old? And the answer to that was about 73. So you see, there's a 20-year difference between what Americans think should be retirement age compared to when you get old. I was involuntarily retired from the White House by the 1980 election, and I was 56. And so I thought about that a lot, and I noticed then that the average life expectancy for someone my age was 20 more years. And so I had a very basic question to ask, which other retired people have to ask themselves: what am I going to do with 20 years? And that's a question that not very many people ask themselves. As a matter of fact, the average American in adult life spend about half of the adult years after retirement. And very seldom do we make plans about how we're going to spend those retirement years, half of our adult life. About the only thing we plan for is how can I gather enough money and put it in the bank so that I can support myself and perhaps my spouse during those retirement years. But what are we going to do during those retirement years is a question that we don't ask very often. And I've known a lot of people who were my age that worked really hard. Some of them became quite wealthy, as a matter of fact. All their employment years were spent trying to earn as much money as possible. And they made zero plans, you might say, for what am I going to do after I'm no longer employed. And they retire at the age of 60 or 65, and a lot of them die within a few months. Part of the reason for their death is because they had nothing for which to live. And Sigmund Freud was asked, what is the key to a pleasant life in retirement years? And he said 2 words: work, and what do you think the other one was? Love. Work and love. That's been a very important thing for me. I've seen the government involvement in aging years dramatically change since I was born. When I was born, I looked up the statistics, the government contributed an average of $1 per year for health care, which meant that the government spent practically nothing. And it wasn't the federal government's responsibility to take care of people in their old age. It was entirely up to the families themselves, or sometimes to local governments. And we had, in every county in Georgia at least, there was what we called a poor house, poor person's house. And if you lived to an advanced age, then you could go and live in that house with a bunch of other poverty-stricken people, and you could sit on the front porch, or if you were more active, you could work in the nearby large garden where vegetables were grown to use to feed the people who lived in the poorhouse. And there was not any money given to people for spending, not even $5 a month. And so that's all they did, was just exist in a community, in a house with a lot of other people. By 1950, the government was spending an average of $100 a year for medical care for older people. And the latest statistics are $8,000 a year per person, for an older person, just for medical care. You see how it's been an exponential increase. And this is just for medical care. And that would include Medicaid and Medicare. And the Medicare fund will be broke, if nothing changes, in just 6 more years. And the other major, and Medicaid, of course, as you know, is for poorer people. And Medicare is for a wider range of people, older people and those who have physical disabilities. And our government at this point, you see that the government's about to close down tomorrow because the Republicans and Democrats can't get together. But 3 items that haven't been addressed at all by the president, who's supposed to take the leadership, is Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, because they are so profoundly important. And by the year 2030 or so, just the cost of Medicare itself will equal the entire federal budget. And it's growing still exponentially from $1 a year to $100 a year, and now to $8,000 a year. It keeps on going up, and nobody's restraining that. Social Security was devised during my lifetime. I was just a child. I was 8 years old or so when Roosevelt was elected, and not long after that, Social Security was formed. And the idea was for working people, right, to take a small portion of their salary, put it in a pot, and then later, when you got to be old, you would have enough money to at least live on. And at that time, when it first started, there were about 20 working people for every retired person on Social Security. Now, it's 3 to 1. There's a retired person for every 3 people. And the Social Security fund has been greatly changed to benefit people like me. I figured up when I wrote my book that my wife and I will receive about $200,000 more in Social Security funds than we put into Social Security. And that's a typical figure for wealthy people. And that could increase that was 15 years ago when I wrote the book. So that shows what's happening in Social Security. And Social Security hasn't been modified now for decades. And some profound changes need to be made in Social Security. But the problem is that older people now control the government. Why? One is we're well organized. When I got to be 50 years old, I was still in the White House. In fact, I hadn't even got to the White House. And my wife and I got a notice that I was eligible for the AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. And I just threw it in the trash. I don't believe I'm that old. And now, of course, AARP is extraordinarily powerful. One reason that not only are the older people organized, but we have become accustomed to special privileges, particularly those of us who are financially independent. And another thing is that we vote. Roughly speaking, this is roughly speaking, people vote about the same percentage as the years they've lived. People your age, about 20% vote. When you get to be 40 years old, roughly 40% of the people vote. When you get to be 65 years old, roughly 65% of the people vote. So you see that members of Congress, and presidents too, to whom do they listen when they're getting ready to make changes in the law? They listen to the old people, because we'll have a relative sinecure compared to others. I also found out when I wrote the book that there are 12 times as many dollars spent on a retired person as it is the average person under 18 years old. And that includes education and everything else. Well, is that fair? No, I don't think it's fair. But the things that would suit me fine are changes in the Social Security laws and the Medicare laws and others that I doubt that the politicians are going to have enough courage to address until it's an absolute crisis, which is rapidly approaching. I would be glad to reduce my Social Security payments. I don't need it. I can get along without Social Security. I have a retirement income from having been president equal to the salary of a member of Congress. Every former president, that's the definition of our retirement fund. So every time the congressman increase their salary, kind of surreptitiously, so nobody notices it, 3% or 4%, I get a 3 or 4% increase in my retirement. And I also have paid from Emory for being a professor. And I make the vast majority of my income is from my books. Well, Freud said work and love. I think that this is something that should be addressed by people even your age, to start thinking, what am I going to do after I finish my career? Steve and I were talking on the way over here. The average person who goes to work, say, in New York City or Atlanta, Georgia, on the police force, or to be a fireman, maybe just finished college, we'll say. They're, 22 years old. And a lot of them retire at the end of 20 years of service. They're not 53 years old, which is the retirement age I mentioned the first day, or what? 42 years old. Retired at 42 years old with half pay. And if they want to work 10 more years and reach the ancient age of 52, then they have 30 years pay, 30 years of service, and their retirement is probably 75% or sometimes 100% of what they have been earning. And if you have been a member of a local union, like you're a fireman in New York, then you get the 100% of your highest year's pay, which includes overtime. So I've seen statistics that show the last year that a New York fireman or policeman works, it explodes with overtime. And that's the basis on which their retirement is predicated. I've got my youngest son is named Jeffrey, and ever since I was a governor, he's always moaned about the fact that he was getting cheated on Social Security. And for a few years, I argued with him. I don't argue with him anymore because he's been right all along. Because you are going to be faced at your young age with a very increasingly heavy burden of taxes of all kinds just to pay for your parents' retirement and medical care in old age. That's unfortunate, but that's what's going to happen. Well, I've been blessed in my life. You know, I've had a good education. I've went to 4 different universities. I have had success to some degree in politics, and since then, I've put into effect the plans for retirement. I really didn't know when I left the White House, without any immediate plans, what I was going to do. Rosa and I built our home back in 1961. It's a house in which we still live. And I had been a long years in the Navy and so forth. So that was the 16th house that my wife and I occupied after we got married. And we haven't changed the house at all. We've modified the house to some degree, but we haven't changed homes. And so we decided when we left the Navy, when we left the governor's mansion, when we left the White House, to go back to Plains. So we have a very stable environment in which to live. Both my ancestors and Rosa's ancestors, who were born in the 1700s, are buried in Plains area. And the farm that we operate now, we've owned ever since 1833. That's when the Indians were forced to leave West Georgia, and it took them 5 years to survey the land, and our ancestors have owned the land ever since. So we have a stable life. So when I use my life as an example, I know that I am representing a privileged class in a way of stability and happy marriage. If we don't break up in the next 3 months, Rosa and I will be married 65 years. And so that brings up another question, and I'm not going to talk very much longer, but what do you do when you have 2 different people, both with minds of their own, and I'm putting that mildly, who are forced to live together after one of them or both of them is retired? Rosa ran our house. She still takes care of all the bank accounts. She still takes care of all our investments. She still takes care of the needs of our children and grandchildren, and now some great-grandchildren. And I've always kind of run the business with Rosa and helping me there, and we run the Carter Center together, in fact. So we've been partners in almost everything. But Rosa was quite different when I was married her. She came from a family that was totally different from my own. I won't go into details to describe it, but hers was a very calm, reticent, I'd say compatible group of people. who occupied her family. Mine were not calm, they were not reticent, and they were not compatible. Rosa's family still has 2 family reunions in Plains every year. My family has never dreamed of having a family reunion, except on my grandfather's 200th birthday year, we had one family reunion, just his descendants, and we had 980 people show up. Because I was a former president, everybody wanted to come get a picture with me. So we got a picture with 980 people. We don't know why. But we have a different life and so forth. Rosa was very reticent when she was young. But I had a lot of things to do. I was a naval officer. I was traveling all over the world. I had different responsibilities. I'd been to 4 different colleges and that sort of thing. So we have had to enter our retirement years after I left the White House with a great deal of accommodation. And we are not inherently compatible. Rosa has now written 4 books. I've written 26 books. And we write completely differently. One of the books that I wrote before this one here is called Everything to Gain, Making the Most of a Rest of Your Life. In our 65 years of marriage, this was the worst mistake we made, because we decided to write the book together by Jimmy and Rosa and Carter. That was a horrible mistake. It almost broke up our marriage. I get up early in the morning. I write very rapidly. Rosa likes to get up later than I do, and she likes to stay up late at night and so forth. She writes very slowly and carefully. Every sentence has got to be perfect before she writes the next sentence. And we both had computers in the early days. It wasn't a computer. And so we decided that Rosa would write one chapter, I would write the next chapter. So I would write my chapter in maybe 3 or 4 days. Rosa would labor over hers. So when she got my chapter to go over, she looked on it as a rough draft. But when I got the chapter she had written, she considered it to be, have descended from Mount Sinai, like, that God had given her this text, and it was sacred, and if I changed a word in a sentence, it was painful for her. So we had an absolute breakdown in ability to communicate. We could only communicate with ugly notes back and forth on our computers. I'm not exaggerating. So we had gotten a fairly good advance on the book, and we decided to give the advance back and tell the publisher, forget about the book. But the editor came down to Plains, and he said, look, why don't you let me be the mediator? He said, you take all the paragraphs on which you and Rosa have not been able to agree, and that was maybe 2%. We could agree on 98%. The 98% was insignificant. The 2% was wrong. I never dreamed my wife had such a faulty memory. I would remember exactly what happened when we had our first date. She was completely wrong about what happened on our first date and so forth. She's not here to correct me here. So he finally said, look, you take all the paragraphs on which you cannot agree, and I'll assign half of them to Jimmy and half of them to Rosalind. And Jimmy doesn't have anything to say about Rosalind's paragraph and vice versa. So if you read our book, Everything to Gain, you'll see that some of the paragraphs have an R by them and some have a J by them. So we survived our marriage. But we had a very different, and Rosalind has been, I'd say, quite accommodating in accepting my adventures. She has become, for instance, a tennis player. And she's become an expert bird watcher. And she's become an expert downhill skier. I had never seen skis until I was 62 years old. Rosa was 59. So we ski together. We watch birds together. Now we play tennis together. We do things together. And she's been willing to accommodate those idiosyncrasies. So we've learned 2 things in our retirement life. And that is, one, to give each other plenty of space. I don't tell her what to do with her life. She doesn't tell me what to do with my life. She has her own program for promoting mental health on a global basis. And I have some of my own things to do. So we don't, and we try to heal our differences before we go to sleep at night. Sometimes we stay up quite late. So those are the 2 basic rules that we have. We don't go to sleep angry, and we give each other plenty of space. So we developed our own independent lives, but together. And the last thing I'll mention is, what do we do with our time? You know, we have almost full time in dealing with the Carter Center now. Even at our advanced age, we still are very active in the affairs of the Carter Center. I teach still at Emory. I lecture every month at Emory. I try to go to every one of the departments at Emory about every year, and Steve helps me arrange those. When I come to Emory, I always have a breakfast meeting, hour and a half, with the president and his wife, and Rosa and I attend that breakfast. That's tomorrow morning. And every month, when I come to Emory, I meet with 3 or 4 professors and deans who are doing exciting and interesting things at Emory, and we have an hour and a half to discuss what the Carter Center is doing and what they do. So I'm deeply involved with Emory. But in addition, I have become quite an accomplished furniture builder. And I've studied, and I work. This is not part of Rosen's. And I've become a fairly good painter. I've taken up art. And so with bird watching, with jobs at Emory, teaching, Rosen is also a lecturer at Emory. When I get through up and start writing a book, and I get up at 5, I read the New York Times and Washington Post, I read the email and so forth, and then I start working on my book, and I might stick with a computer for 3 or 4 or 5 hours a day, and the rest of the time I walk 20 steps out to my wood shop, and I can design and build a bed, or chair, or table, or cabinet, whatever. I really enjoy that. And when I'm not building furniture, I paint. Primarily oils now. I used to use various media, but now I use oils. And if you go to the Carter Center, there are about 50 of my paintings hanging around the wall. I'm not bragging about the quality of them, but at least it's an exciting thing to do, to plan a painting and to actually finish it. And it's kind of a legacy to leave behind. And since I am a former president, I give a piece of furniture or painting every year to the Carter Center, and the Carter Center auctions it off, and our friends, financial friends, bid on them, and they bring a lot of money. And so those are the kind of things we do. We want to hold our family together. This is the last thing I say. We have a very diverse family. Our children are different as much as we are, and our grandchildren are different, and now we have 6 great-grandchildren. We have 12 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren, and 4 children. So when we had our Christmas picture made this year, there were 36 people in the picture. And we live in different places. And so it's very important to me and Rosen to try to let our family members know each other. So we travel all over the world for the Carter Center. We have a lot of frequent flower miles. So every year, on the 27th of December, we all meet somewhere, and we spend a week together. Everybody comes because folks are not in school. Rosa and I pay all the bills, and we pay the travel expenses, so everybody shows up. And so that's what we do to keep our family together. So you see, we have a very good, pleasant life, filled with work, and I would say filled with love. And I didn't talk about volunteerism. I mean, I think that's another thing that you can do when you reach retirement age. You can volunteer to do things that you never did have a chance to do before, to benefit other people, maybe in your own community, just to have be part of a telephone every morning. Churches do this. They have a list of all the retired people who are living by themselves in a whole community. And they get people like you who are retired, and you have a responsibility every morning of calling maybe 10 of those people. And if folks answer the phone and say, I'm okay, then you don't worry about it. But if the phone rings and nobody answers, then it's your duty to go to the house and say, why didn't you answer the phone? You know, those are the kind of things that you can do. My wife and I have a very exciting occupation, almost, of dealing with Habitat for Humanity. Every year, she and I, at our age, we go and work a full week in building a house side by side with a poor family and other volunteers. And we go overseas one year, and we do that in the United States the next year. We've done it now for 27 years. This year, we're going to Haiti, and we'll be building 100 homes in Haiti, very near the center of the earthquake, in 5 days. In Philippines, not too long ago, we built 293 homes in 5 days. We had 14,000 volunteers who came and joined us. So there are a lot of volunteer work that people can do as well. One of the main things that impressed itself on most of my generation was care, caution about how to handle finances. When you grow up during the Depression years, when a full day's salary is $1, you're very cautious about making sure that you have something to care for. And not long ago, I taught a class here in Social Security, in the sociology department, about a county in Georgia, Dodge County, where the professor and her students had studied that county for 20 years. And during a setback in agricultural income, they went in and analyzed how families fared that came from my generation and the generation that would be my children. In my generation, they still own their farms. But the generation that came after mine, a major portion of them had lost their farms because they didn't save and they had borrowed more money than they could. And now young people, the generation today has zero savings. The average person now in the United States has saved nothing. I'm not exaggerating. Whereas if you go to China or somewhere, they save 10 or 15% of their total salary every year. That's one of the problems with China. They're trying to get people to spend more, buy more consumer goods to stimulate the economy. But we don't. We don't save anything. And I don't know what percentage of families in America owe more now than they own. There's nothing there for the future. So I don't think you'll find many people that has more experience with aging than I do. There's some around, but not many. So I've enjoyed talking to you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.